I want to welcome everyone to the book launch and the discussion that kicks off the Vito Marcantonio Forum Rebel Girl series. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Why Now? This event is the first collaboration between the Vito Marcantonio Forum, or the VMF, and the Claudia Jones School for Political Education, two educational and cultural organizations that share a singular vision, that history matters. My name is Maria Lucella, and I'll be your host for the evening. I'm also a founding member of the VMF, and I'd like to acknowledge others who are here tonight: Gerald Meyer, Adam Meyer, Roberto Ragone, Stephen Siciliano, Lisette Colon. There's a whole number of us. We're proud to present the new edition of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's second book, My Life as a Political Prisoner. The Rebel Girl becomes number 11710, originally entitled The Alderson Story, reissued by international publishers, which published the first edition in 1963. So a shout out to Gary Bono, who's with international publishers. And also Dante O'Hara, he's from the Claudia Jones School of Political Education. As a point of reference, I'd like to fast forward a short profile of the VMF and its mission, which is to perpetuate the historic memory and significance of the most electorally successful progressive politician in American history, Congressman Vito Marcantonio. A protege of LaGuardia and the educator Leonard Cavillo, Marcantonio has been called the Thaddeus Stevens of the 20th century. Together, they formed a triumvirate of visionaries who called East Harlem home. What distinguishes VMF events is that we combine aesthetic expressions with political activism, vis-a-vis dramatic presentations, book launches, author talks, films, study groups, or as in this April, activist poetry. Our most recent pre-pandemic event was a collaboration with Chelsea Rising and the Limited Equity Affordability at Penn South, focused on the McCarthy years and its impact on two noble figures, Paul Robeson, the American bass baritone, actor and political activist, and Congressman Vito Marcantonio. Additionally, the fifth and most recent Vito Marcantonio Award was presented to Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer on June 23, 2019. The previous four recipients were Annette Rubenstein, Ralph Fasanella, Pete Pascal, and his daughter is with us tonight, and Melissa Mark Viverito. Prior to that, VMF succeeded in getting the intersection of East 116th Street and Lexington Avenue renamed the Vito Marcantonio Lucky Corner in December 2017. So tonight's program focuses on one of the most charismatic yet often overlooked figures on the American left, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Of the new edition, Trasciatti says, republication of her Alderson memoir could not come at a more opportune moment. Read it, critique it, share it, and all hail the rebel, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Before Professor Trasciatti does her presentation, which is the core of the evening, we wanted to place the evening a little bit in context. It's important to note that Congressman Marcantonio, who predeceased Flynn by about 10 years, announced a nationwide drive to repeal the Smith Act, or the Alien Registration Act, which is the legislation used to incarcerate both Flynn and Jones, as reported in the Daily Worker, August 26, 1940. Originally conceived to corral Nazi sympathizers, it was later used to imprison communists. And I'll read a very short comment by Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, who very much admired Flynn. In Dorothy Day's Journals and Diaries, she described her life as an advocacy journalist. All that winter, I enjoyed myself hugely, attending labor bazaars and balls given by socialists, anarchists, and IWWs. The most effective speaker I heard was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was working with the IWWs and who was one of the leaders of the strike on the Mesabi Iron Range. She came to New York to get money for the relief of the miners' families and for labor defense. Wherever she spoke, the audience wept and gave heartily to the cause. That night I heard her. She was speaking in the Brownsville section, and I gave everything I had in my pocket, not even saving car fare, so that I had to borrow the fare back to the office and go without lunches for some days afterwards. After Trasciatti presents, we'll have a Q&A session. So feel free to begin typing any questions in the chat box. Dante will be fielding some of those. And then we'll close tonight's event with a word on the genesis of these two organizations, Professor Gerald Meyer for VMF and Dante O'Hara for the Claudia Jones School. And we'll mention a couple of the upcoming events. So just to introduce Professor Trasciatti. Professor Mary Anne Trasciatti, who is president of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition. She's currently working on a collection of personal essays about the fire. Her book on Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's civil liberties activism is currently under contract with Rutgers University Press. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Mary Anne Trasciatti for the book launch tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I want shout out, there's so many people here I don't know, but also so many people that I do. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. And I am delighted to be here tonight. It's my honor to have contributed the foreword to My Life as a Political Prisoner for International Publishers. So thank you, Gary Bono. Which is, as you've heard, the reissued, retitled edition of the Alderson Story, originally published in 1963, a year before Flynn died and the year of my birth. Flynn's account of her experiences at the Alderson Federal Penitentiary for Women is essentially what this book is about. I need to, can you not hear me? I'm getting, okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. She was sent there, as you heard, after having been indicted under the Smith Act, which is a peacetime sedition law passed in 1940. And we might want to have a conversation about the kinds of laws that get passed and could mean for the left, but I'll save that for the end. As you heard, I'm presently finishing a book on Flynn's civil liberties activism. It's been a bit stalled by COVID, but it is near completion. And I hope that when it is published by Rutgers University Press, that you will pick it up, read it, and let me know what you think. I look forward to those conversations. It is fitting that the Vito Marcantonio Forum and the Claudia Jones School for Political Education are co-sponsoring this talk. I'm grateful to both organizations. Flynn, Marcantonio, and Jones were an extraordinary trio of intellectuals and activists, really a brilliant bunch. Mark, as he was called, spoke out against the Smith Act, and Jones and Flynn were arrested, indicted, and imprisoned under the Smith Act. The two women enjoyed a warm, mutually respectful relationship. They were comrades in the truest sense of the word. And Jones figures prominently in the prison memoir, and I'll give you a little bit, a taste of that towards the end of the talk. So my comments will be divided into three parts. First, we'll talk about some highlights of Flynn's life and work, the things that led up to her Smith Act prosecution. We'll talk a little bit then about the Smith Act itself and the trial, and then finally a brief discussion of the memoir, and then we'll have a Q&A. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the political career of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, which is almost the life of Flynn. She became an activist at a very young age. Flynn was born in New Hampshire. We have a Concord, New Hampshire person in the audience. Woohoo! August 8th, 1890, and her family moved to the Bronx when she was quite young. They lived among struggling, poor, immigrant, working class people. Her mom, Annie Gurley, was Irish. Her dad, Tom Flynn, was Irish American. Both parents were socialists and fighters for Irish freedom. And the Flynn family was friends with James Connolly, the socialist martyr and hero of the Easter Uprising, as well as James Larkin, the socialist turned communist. And these relationships helped to shape her politics in deep and profound ways. So the material conditions around her, poverty and struggle, as well as the ideological education she received from her family and her friends, were the foundation for Flynn's deep understanding of the inequalities that pervaded US society and politics, and of her broad internationalist vision. To be an Irish American for Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was to be an ally of the oppressed at home and abroad, through active involvement in the class struggle, and increasingly over the course of her career in the struggle for Black liberation in the US, and by supporting anti-imperialist movements around the globe. This political life is divided into two parts. The first is the rebel girl part, and that's the part that most people are familiar with. This was Flynn's syndicalist period, where she focused her energy on direct action rather than electoral politics. She became an organizer for the industrial workers of the world when she was 16, and to quote her from her autobiography, "I took to it like a duck to water." The Wobblies were an exciting, audacious group. The union was at the heart of some of the most important labor struggles of the early 20th century, and it was more inclusive than the rival American Federation of Labor. Women, immigrants, Black workers, unskilled workers, itinerant workers, otherwise known as hobos, all were welcome in the one big union. Now, this was the promise of the union. They didn't always live up to it. It wasn't always an easy road to hoe for women, immigrants, and Black workers, but the promise was there. This was the inclusive union. And as a member of the IWW, Flynn led important free speech fights in Missoula, Spokane, and Paterson, New Jersey. And the tactics that she devised, particularly for Missoula and Spokane, really shaped the IWW free speech fights in all of the future locations. She also played an important role in many IWW strikes, including the Lawrence strike. Bob Ferrant is here, shout out to Bob, which started in 1912 on this date with a walkout by Polish women workers. So shout out to the women workers. But also the Paterson Silk Strike, the New York Hotel Workers Strike, the Mesabi Minnesota Iron Workers Strike, a number of worker uprisings. She was there. She broke from the IWW in 1916. Nonetheless, she was arrested for being a wobbly in 1917 as part of the raids by the federal government to crush the union during World War I. And she escaped imprisonment. She actually escaped trial and imprisonment by petitioning President Woodrow Wilson. In 1918, in a response to the raids and to the oppressive nature of the Espionage Act passed during the war, she founded the Workers' Defense Union to advocate for labor activists arrested, imprisoned, and otherwise silenced during and after World War I. And as the head of the Workers' Defense Union, she was an advocate for Sacco and Vanzetti. Indeed, she was responsible, I believe, for turning them into household names in the 1920s. She was also an advocate for A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen when their newspaper, The Messenger, was silenced by the Postmaster General for publishing ostensibly seditious claims, and for the victims of the 1918 Elaine Massacre, sharecroppers in Arkansas who were brutally beaten and killed when they attempted to organize a union, as well as countless other activists, many of whom had no other organization to advocate for them. She was there. She was instrumental in forging the liberal radical alliance that historians note was at the heart of the post-war civil liberties movement in the United States. And she was recognized for her talent at bringing together a fractious left to work with the liberal establishment. As head of the Workers' Defense Union, she called for recognition of political prisoner status in the United States. She did not succeed. Unlike many other countries in the world, the US does not recognize political prisoners. We do not acknowledge that the state punishes some individuals because of their political beliefs and actions, not because they've committed crimes, but recognition of this status was something that Flynn worked for from 1918, essentially until she died, hence the title of her memoir, My Life as a Political Prisoner. She also fought deportations. She saw that distinctions between good and bad immigrants, whether it was radicals and non-radicals during the first Red Scare or now, I'm sure she would take issue with the distinction between illegal and legal immigrants. She recognized that these distinctions were tools for dividing the working class, one group against the other. She also, with the Workers' Defense Union, assisted anti-imperialist activists working in the US, and not just the Irish. She provided office space for the Friends of Freedom for India and was an advocate for the organization. She provided material aid to imprison Mexican anti-imperialists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She truly was an internationalist. And for this work, she earned a reputation for being a staunch defender of civil liberties. In 1920, along with a number of other individuals, she would help to found the American Civil Liberties Union. She worked with that group for 20 years, and we'll talk about in a minute or two how that association came to an end. In 1926, while on a speaking tour for Sacco and Vanzetti around the US, the Workers' Defense Union had disbanded in 24, but she continued to be active in doing this kind of defense work for Sacco and Vanzetti and others. She broke down physically and emotionally. She found out that the love of her life, the Italian anarchist Carlo Tresca, had had an affair with her younger sister, Bina, and that had produced a child. And she was also just physically and emotionally exhausted from all of the advocating, all of the agitating, all of the travel. And so she moved to Portland, Oregon, where she remained for nearly a decade with Marie Acquis, a physician, anarchist, birth control advocate, and out lesbian. The end of her sojourn to Portland marked the beginning of the second stage of her career. So the Communist Party years from roughly 1937 to 1964, including her 1961 election as chair of the party. She was the first female chair of the party. These are the years when Flynn was no longer a girl, but she was still a rebel. Now, the fit between Flynn and the party was a natural one for three reasons. First, because like the IWW, the Communist Party in 1937 was the most active, inclusive, and exciting organization on the left. And Flynn wanted to be in the middle of the fray. She thrived on it, and she missed it when she was out in Portland. And so that's one reason why this was an excellent fit for her. The second, as I discussed, she's a coalition builder by nature and by habit. And this was the Popular Front period. The Popular Front, probably most of you know that, a broad alliance of communist, socialist, and liberal organizations brought together to defend bourgeois democracy against a common fascist threat. Flynn was used to working in coalition, and this was where she wanted to be, what she wanted to do. The third reason, implicit in the second reason that I gave you, was that Flynn was an anti-fascist, and the Communist Party was dedicated to fighting fascism. Flynn had been an anti-fascist since the 1920s, since at least 1923. In fact, she was one of the first American members of Antifa, we can put it that way, one of the first Anglophones to recognize that this was a serious issue. When most others on the left saw his rise to power as an Italian problem, she realized that anti-fascism posed an existential threat to democracy everywhere. And she issued dire warnings and speeches, predominantly in the Northeast, but in a variety of cities and towns. She issued dire warnings about fascism as a danger to American democracy. She argued that the Klan and the American Legion were the American equivalent of the fascisti. And later in her career, she would argue that lynching of Black Americans and tactics for voter suppression, as well as things like housing discrimination, civil rights violations, were also fascist-inspired tactics. So her commitment to anti-fascism was unwavering from 1923 until the moment she took her last breath. And it is fitting that her first appearance as a communist was at an anti-fascist rally. In April of 1937, Flynn spoke at a meeting in New York City to honor members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the US volunteers who had gone to Spain to fight fascism after the coup staged by General Francisco Franco. She also spoke out against Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. And these two topics, the fascism in Spain, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, would be topics that she would return to throughout the 30s into the 40s. In the late 1930s, the US witnessed what historians have called a Little Red Scare. And this is basically a period of rising anti-communism between the first big Red Scare and the second Red Scare in the McCarthy era. And during the Little Red Scare, anti-communists within the American Civil Liberties Union were increasingly concerned about the organization's reputation. These were liberal anti-communists. After the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which was signed on October 23rd, 1939, there was growing internal pressure within the ACLU to dissociate the organization from the CPUSA. Essentially, liberals in the ACLU wanted to shed the organization's radical past because it was founded as an organization for radicals and labor activists, and to embrace a politically neutral version of free speech. And lots of people have applauded that politically neutral version of free speech, but that's the version that gave us Citizens United. And so this is, I think, a problematic moment in the history of the ACLU. In February of 1940, the organization passed a controversial communazi resolution. And essentially, that's a both sides resolution. It makes the argument that communists and fascists are essentially both sides of the same dangerous, seditious coin. And the organization decided, or a majority of voters for the resolution decided, that neither communists nor fascists, particularly Nazis, were welcome on the executive committee of the American Civil Liberties Union because their commitment to civil liberties could not be trusted. And this was a thinly veiled attempt to get people like Flynn, who was, by the time the resolution passed, the only self-identified public communist on the board. So they wanted her to step down, but she wouldn't do it. She refused to go quietly. And so she forced them to try her and purge her from the organization. On May 8th, 1940, they did just that. It was a really difficult time for Flynn. She was defending Earl Browder, who was who was in trouble for having allegedly committed passport fraud. And in her personal life, she was mourning the loss of her son, who had died in March of cancer. But nonetheless, she stood firm and forced them to oust her, to actually, to make the move rather than let her do it for them. So ponder the irony. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn had been an anti-fascist since at least 1923, before anybody else on the ACLU executive committee. And now the ACLU was telling her that her political ideas were as dangerous as fascism. That cut deep. Although the vote to expel surely hurt her, it also hurt the ACLU. The organization was subjected to charges of hypocrisy. Many prominent members resigned, and it appears that contributions, although I think the Roger Baldwin and others on the board tried to hide the evidence of this, that contributions declined because people were outraged by what they had done to this champion of civil liberties. But more importantly, Flynn's ouster from the ACLU gave the liberal seal of approval to anti-communism. Here's the thinking. Well, if the ACLU finds that communists are bad and has no problem violating their civil liberties, then nobody else should have a problem either. And so it kind of set the stage for the liberal anti-communism that followed and for everything else. In 1976, the ACLU recognized its error and admitted that they had done wrong in passing the resolution and voting to expel Flynn. By then, she was dead. The damage was done in the second Red Scare. It was too little, too late, but they are on record saying that they had done the wrong thing and regretted it. So also in 1940, the same year that Flynn is kicked out of the ACLU, Congress passes the Alien Registration Act. This is the first peacetime anti-sedition law enacted since the 1789 Alien and Sedition Act. It was popularly known as the Smith Act after Howard Smith, Democratic representative from Virginia, who was its principal officer. And just as an aside here, I think there's a message: beware of Democratic administrations and Democratic elected officials during times of crisis. Their track record is not good. The Espionage Act was called for and signed into law by Wilson. The Smith Act, proposed by a Democratic congressman and signed into law by FDR. The Smith Act made it a crime to undermine the morale of the US military, to advocate the overthrow of the US government by force or violence, and it required the registration and fingerprinting of all adult non-citizen residents. And you can see where the fingerprinting and registration part is going, right? I mean, this is the path towards internment. Now, there actually was a concentration camp provision in the original bill, but it was written out during the debate over the act. But other concentration camp bills were proposed in its wake. There was one, the Hobbs Concentration Act bill, that was proposed, I think, in 41 or 42, and Flynn vehemently opposed it because she recognized the gross human rights violation in building camps to essentially to incarcerate immigrants who were to be deported but couldn't because the situation in their home country was as yet too volatile. That law thankfully didn't pass. While debate was going on over the Smith Act, the CPUSA in the Daily Worker and in other publications opposed the law as anti-immigrant, antithetical to civil liberties, and un-American. And once it was passed by Congress, they urged FDR not to sign it. But there's no evidence that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn spoke against the Smith Act. If anybody has any, I'd really love to see it. Please feel free to send it to me. I'm not sure why she didn't. It was pretty clear that it would eventually unleash a feeding frenzy, as did the Espionage Act, but she did not speak against it, alas. And as with the 1917 Espionage Act, this law proved a potent weapon against the left. The first significant indictments came in 1941 against 39 members of the Socialist Workers' Party, Trotskyists, 15 of whom were Teamsters. And there's evidence. Donna Haverty-Stack has a really good book, Trotskyists on Trial, where she argues convincingly that there was collusion between the anti-communists in the Teamsters Union and the federal government to get the Trotskyists out. So we have this disturbing trend that we actually have members of the labor union participating in the construction of a surveillance state against radical labor activists, which is, I think, sad, but alas, true. Now, the trial was a travesty in my estimation, and I'm not the only person who thinks this. The evidence against the defendants amounted to books, pamphlets, newspapers, and the like. So this was a trial of political ideas. Now, the defense had argued that the clear and present danger standard should be applied, and the prosecution argued, obviously, that they shouldn't have to do that. It was not an established precedent, and in fact, the prosecution won. They had to prove only that the defendants had conspired to advocate the violent overthrow of the US government. That's think about that. They didn't have to prove that they actually advocated the overthrow of the US government, just that they conspired to advocate. So that sets the bar for seditious speech really low. And as a result, 18 of the defendants, including one woman, were found guilty and sentenced to 12 to 16 months in prison. And the one woman was actually served her time at the Alderson Federal Penitentiary, where Flynn and Jones would be incarcerated. The Supreme Court refused to entertain a review of the law. And another sad moment, the Communist Party did not oppose the arrests or the indictments or the imprisonment of their Trotskyist rivals. But not that it would have done any good, but they didn't do it anyway. And it was not long after the end of World War II when the Smith Act was then turned against them. In 1949, in an attempt to decapitate the party, 11 CP leaders were arrested, indicted, and tried. And this was another trial of political opinions, political ideas, with the same kind of evidence, books and pamphlets and articles and speech transcripts, etc. All of the 11 were found guilty. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn chaired the Smith Act Defense Fund to raise money and generate sympathy for them, but it was a really tough sell in that particular historical moment. And in 1950, things got even worse, if you can imagine it, with the passage of the McCarran Act, which basically required members of the Communist Party and 25 other political organizations to register with the federal government, so they would have a database of radicals. And Flynn regarded the Smith Act and the McCarran Act as fascist-like laws, and I believe that she was correct in that. In 1951, a second group of Smith Act victims was arrested, and she is among them, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, along with 3 other women, Claudia Jones, Betty Gannett, and Mary Anne Bachrach. Mary Anne Bachrach is really ill and she is not imprisoned, but she was one of the 4 who was rounded up. At her trial, Flynn, at the trial, Flynn acted as her own counsel. Now, she had wanted to be in her youth a constitutional lawyer, and she had always had an interest in civil liberties and was this really strong advocate. But there was a really practical reason why she did this as well. Nobody wanted to defend these people. It was almost impossible. And she tells the story of how they were, the equivalent of knocking on doors and saying, "Hey, will you help us?" And people feared for their livelihood and their reputations, and they wouldn't do it. So the speeches that Flynn gave in court offer, I believe, a stirring indictment of capitalist justice and a defense of the right of all Americans to their own political beliefs and opinions. And let me read you a couple of excerpts from her opening statement. "We will prove to you," Flynn argued, "that it is not the communists who have advocated or practiced force and violence, but that it is the employing class, which has done both throughout the history of my life in the American labor movement. Like General Sherman Bell, who said in Colorado during a miners' strike, To hell with habeas corpus, we'll give them post-mortems. We will prove to you that it is not we who flaunt the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but that it has always been done by the employing class. We will prove that we are fighting here for our constitutional and democratic rights, not to advocate force and violence, but to expose and stop its use against the people. We will demonstrate that in fighting for our rights, we believe we are defending the constitutional rights of all Americans. We believe we are acting as good Americans. Well, the court didn't agree. They did not see it that way. And in 1953, all of the second-tier Smith Act defendants were found guilty. The appeals process lasted for 2 years, between 53 and 55, and ultimately it ended with Flynn and Claudia Jones and Betty Gannett going to jail. Flynn served 28 months at the Alderson Federal Penitentiary for Women. Claudia Jones, 10 months before she was released. And then she was eventually, after a health scare, she was deported, actually, to England. And it wasn't until 1957, Yates versus the United States, that the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment protects radical speech unless it presents a clear and present danger. So finally, we have the clear and present danger standard. So the title of Flynn's Alderson memoir, My Life as a Political Prisoner, reflects Flynn's longstanding commitment to civil liberties. She acknowledges that there are political prisoners in the US, that we do incarcerate people for their ideas and for the things they say, not the things they do. And that recognition is part of what sustains her throughout her 28 months at Alderson. In the book, and certainly while she was at Alderson, she acknowledged her fellow politicals, which include some pretty extraordinary Puerto Rican nationalists that she talks about in the memoir. But as she notes, her aim was not to call attention to the plight of communists or other political activists who were imprisoned. Instead, her aim was to highlight the inhumanity of what passed for justice in the United States as it was experienced by these ordinary women that she found herself surrounded by, and to call for change. Many of the topics she addressed in the book make it feel like she could have written it yesterday. She talks about the dehumanizing effects of incarceration. She talks about, or she writes about, the militarization creep into the prison system. The class composition of the prisoners. At one point she says, well, there were no rich women here, right? And the racial bias of the justice system. She describes prison as a racist institution, both before and after integration. And ironically, after the desegregation order is received, Alderson officials ask Flynn and Jones to help desegregate the prison because they knew that as communists, they would know how to do this. As a white woman, Flynn would know, because she was a communist, how to talk to Black women, Jones, vice versa. So there's a pretty interesting irony here. But even within this order to desegregate, the white guards did not want to work with the Black prison guards. Black prisoners were assigned to the nastiest jobs, surprise, surprise, like working in the piggery. So even if they came from urban areas, they were just assumed to know how to raise pigs, and so they would put them in the piggery. She also highlights the exploitation of prison labor. And she argues that addiction, many of the women with whom she was imprisoned were addicts, and she makes the observation that addiction is a disease, not a moral failure, and we should treat it as such. This is a very, very forward-thinking approach. Very few people were saying this at the time. So it's filled with observations like this that I think make it a really important work. Ultimately, the Alderson, My Life as a Political Prisoner, the account of her time in Alderson presents a rare personal account of what it's like to be a woman behind bars. It shows Flynn's compassion for her fellow inmates, recognition of her own relative privilege. She always had money. She always had people sending letters to her because of her party connections and her family, but she recognized that the women around her, many of them did not, and she did what she could to share with them as best she could. And it also shows a deep bond between Flynn and Claudia Jones. And I just want to read you a little excerpt from what Flynn wrote when Claudia Jones was leaving. Claudia gave each cottage inmate a gift, which she had made, a ring, pin, ashtray, and the like. They tearfully bade her farewell at lockup time. In the early dawn, the officer who came to dress her this was still the procedure then, opened my door for a hurried goodbye. My window faced the roadway and I was able to see her leave. She turned to wave, tall, slender, beautiful, dressed in golden brown, and then she was gone. This was the hardest day I spent in prison. I felt so alone. Betty was far away. We seldom were able to meet. I had the desolate feeling that I might never see Claudia again. When, if ever, would I get a passport? I did finally in 1960, only to have it canceled under the infamous McCarran Act now, while I write in 62. A few months later, after a siege of illness in New York, in a New York hospital, Claudia was forced to go to England. Not long after that, her devoted father died. I have not seen Claudia since. And the book is filled with observations like that I think are very, very poignant. Writing about the prison memoir years later in her own book, Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis observed, while Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's autobiography, I Speak My Own Peace, or The Rebel Girl, provides fascinating glimpses into her experiences as an IWW agitator, her second book, The Alderson Story, or My Life as a Political Prisoner, reveals a new political maturity and a more profound consciousness of racism. As a leader of the Communist Party, this is still Angela Davis, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn had developed a deep commitment to the Black liberation struggle and had come to realize that Black people's resistance is not always consciously political. At Alderson, she made friends more easily among the Black women in prison than she did among the white inmates. And the Black women, in turn, were more receptive to Elizabeth. Perhaps they sensed in this white woman communist an instinctive kinship in struggle. Although 28 months in prison was undoubtedly hard for an older woman, Flynn left Alderson unbowed. And I just want to share another quote with you. I'm not writing this book to evoke any special sympathy, but for me or my comrades, though the injustice committed against us was great, I want the reader not to forget that in the United States, blessed citadel of democracy, we were prisoners for opinion under a fascist-like Thought Control Act. Our imprisonment was a disgrace to our country, not to us. So she is not cowed by this experience. On the contrary, she comes out formidable. So like all memoir, this book has a rhetorical purpose. Flynn was advocating for women who could not, or for good reason, would not advocate for themselves. In so doing, she showed the hypocrisy of a country that purports to be the land of the free. The Alderson Story is thus an important book. It was well received in the time by progressive social workers who felt it should be required reading for everyone in their field. It got favorable reviews in CP publications in the US and around the world. But many outlets ignored the book or published reviews that discounted Flynn's observations simply because of her politics. I believe that it deserves a wider audience than it has had in the past, and I hope after hearing me talk that you agree. Flynn died in Moscow on September 5th, 1964. When she died, the New York Times ran a front page obituary. In it, they quoted a May Day speech that she'd given pretty recently before her death. Well, the May before her death. Before another half century has passed, she said, the contradictions of capitalism, its incompatibility with human welfare, and the growing demands of the people for peace, security, and happiness will result, I believe, in a socialist America. What a May Day that will be to celebrate. Hail to it and work for it. And the Times added, Miss Flynn's life was dedicated to that May Day. And all I can say to that is, it surely was. Here's to the rebel, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Thanks.
You can unmute.
Hello, everyone. Dante from the Claudia Jones School. Great talk, Mary Anne. That was amazing. Yeah, so we got one question in the chat asking, and apologies if you don't hear me, how should the left respond to government suppression laws that get pitched at addressing right-wing activity but end up being used against leftist radicals?
That's a really good question. I'm actually rather disturbed by the calls that I'm seeing for increased surveillance right now, and for that I believe we probably will see, if we're not seeing already, for tougher laws against sedition. As somebody wrote in the chat, we can expect it now. We absolutely can. I think we need to make that fine distinction between making sure that those who are responsible for the insurrectionary acts on the Capitol earlier this or last week actually are brought to justice under the laws we've already got on the books. And I think there are sufficient laws on the books to bring them to justice. But I think that we need to resist. We on the left need to speak out vociferously and vehemently against empowering federal authorities, or any authorities actually, with blanket laws against sedition, because they never, ever end well. The Sedition 1917 Espionage and then the subsequent Sedition Act, there were no German spies, or I mean, I don't think any spies were convicted, but countless labor activists. And again, under the Smith Act, I think one Nazi was prosecuted and successfully and imprisoned, and dozens of communists. So this time, will it be Communist Party members? No, as somebody wrote in the chat, they'll come down hard on Black Lives Matter. They're already trying to pin this on Antifa. They will use these laws against Antifa. I think it's a really fine line, but I think we have to walk it. And I think we have to not be afraid of really standing up for civil liberties and people's right to dissent and to protest, but just not to break the law and threaten people in the way that it was done last week. And if we have somebody who's an expert, a legal expert, my expertise is really on how radicals, Flynn as a prism sort of for understanding how radicals responded to these things, but I welcome input from anybody who knows the law better than I do.
There is another question.
Could I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jerry Meyer. Marion, I loved it. God, it was just wonderful hearing you. Lulu Lolo is, really pioneered with this, Where Are the Women?
Mm-hmm.
As part of a campaign of getting memorials, statues, etc., monuments to women. And in the process of this developed out of an understanding, investigation that there were only 5 statues to women in all of Manhattan. Of 300 statues, only 5. And so a really ideal candidate for being memorialized and having a statue would be Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And just to throw the idea out, I know it's a bit ambitious, but I think, our groups and other groups, that would be something which could also create interest about the book, to buy the book, and to disseminate the book. But I would just like to throw that out, like plant a seed that we would want to see, and a statue probably in Union Square. There might be some other places too where it'd be very, very appropriate. But I just loved hearing you today. It was very, very wonderful to hear you. Wonderful.
Well, Jerry, I of course I would once the Triangle Memorial is built, I would lead that charge. I'm feeling it doesn't take another decade, but I don't think it will happen because she was a communist. I don't think we're far enough out of the McCarthy era and the Cold War yet to do that. But it would be terrific. I mean, she was fantastic. But I'm not sure that we're ready yet for the first female chair of the CP to have a statue in Union Square. But if we did, she better be orating. Because that was her thing. There's a question in the chat about Margaret Sanger saying that the IWW neglected women and mothers. Flynn's an interesting case. I think this is Bob Ferren who asked this question. She had a child and then kind of mostly let her mom and her sisters raise him. So she's not exactly a role model for women who are looking at how to balance motherhood and their activism. That was her solution. It did not always sit well with her son, who at one point said, why did you have me if you don't ever have any time to raise me? I think Flynn recognized the shortcomings of the IWW. She had a falling out in part because over money for labor defense, who had control of the money. Haywood, I think, wanted more control, and they had a falling out over that. And also, when I said that Flynn was rounded up, or not rounded up, but she was indicted under the Espionage Act, it was for having authored a pamphlet on sabotage when she was a wobbly. And she made the argument that, as the IWW had done in Spokane and Patterson and elsewhere, in Spokane and Missoula and San Diego and elsewhere, that all of the arrested wobblies should go to trial separately. Haywood said no. We should do a mass trial together. And that was another difference that contributed to their falling out. Flynn, because she had connections, was able to appeal to Woodrow Wilson successfully for herself, Tresca, and Arturo Giovannitti. Haywood actually did not make good on his own idea that they would all stand together in solidarity as one. He jumped bail and fled to the Soviet Union, and so never came to trial either. I consider that a much grosser dereliction of duty than Flynn's kind of, arguing her way out of trial, because Flynn stayed and then worked to get the wobblies who had been imprisoned when she wasn't to get released, while Haywood took off. So, she had her issues with the IWW, of course, and I don't think it was always an easy road to hoe, but the juggling of motherhood and activism was really not something she spoke a lot about. She found her own solution.
All right, we have a few other questions. Let's see, so this one was early on. I would like to ask for further comments from the speakers about the significance of a positive, humanizing portrayal of Flynn in fiction, like that of Jess Walter's Cold Millions, and the role of fiction featuring activists in raising consciousness. In the few cases they are portrayed fairly and not as stereotypes.
So I just bought the book, and I write fan letters to people when I like what they do. I wrote him a fan letter and thanked him for doing that, because I think that book will probably do more to awaken people's consciousness to Flynn, just because fiction reaches such a wide audience. So I thought it was great, and I think I'd love to see a documentary on her, but I think that fiction has a reach that is extraordinary. So I think it's terrific. Maria, I don't know if you want to comment, since you're.
Oh, I just about I actually also wrote that guy a note, and I invited him to this because I thought, that's the kind of thing that actually can kick off really some sort of curiosity, at least, even if people don't go profoundly involved with it. But yeah, I was so thrilled to see that. Actually, Jerry pointed it out. He found it, and so I don't know. We'll see.
Cool. Yeah.
Be nice.
So,
I think there's a couple. Yeah, there are a couple more questions.
Yeah, I actually had one from myself that I wrote down. So, how would you compare, even if it's fair, but and there's different conditions, obviously, but how would you compare Liz Gurley Flynn's experience as a political prisoner compared to the likes of later generations of political prisoners like Angela Davis, the Black Panthers and MOVE, etc.?
Yeah, well, I don't know a lot about subsequent generations of political prisoners, and I intend to learn more. One of the things, though, I can say about Flynn is that she was protected by her status as a U.S.-born white woman of considerable name recognition, and so that she was well treated, and I mean that she didn't end up in. I mean, she was in prison briefly in Spokane, but that she was able, for the most part, to escape the long arm of the law most of the time until she was quite older, and that it was unavoidable, I think, is nothing short of miraculous. So her celebrity status protected her and her whiteness, and her connections in a way that most, I am imagining, many many imprisoned activists cannot rely on. Certainly not Black activists. But Dante, that's a great question. I don't know enough about what happened to to the Black Panthers in prison to do a really informed answer. But I'd love to have a conversation about it, because I think it's a really great question. I mean, Flynn made some of the same arguments, for example, that Fred Hampton made, in a very different way. He's one of my favorite activists, right? So you can't defeat white capitalism with Black capitalism. You have to answer division with solidarity. When in New York State had its own Red Scare before the national Red Scare, the state legislature established the Joint Committee for the Investigation of Seditious Activities after World War I. And Flynn was labeled an extraordinarily dangerous activist because she went into Harlem and spoke about, as I mentioned, about Black workers needing to organize into the IWW after the Elaine massacre. She advocated for A. Philip Randolph, who was at the time very much on the left, and because she was threatening to bring together Black workers and white workers, she was her meetings were infiltrated. She knew they were there. She used to actually mock them in her speeches. And there are notes, that this is a really dangerous radical. But she was never, nothing happened. Look what happened to Fred Hampton versus what happened to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, right? So, she enjoyed the privileges, again, of having connections and being a white US born woman.
All right, we have a few more questions, and if folks want to keep putting stuff in the chat, we can probably have a few more maybe. So today is the anniversary of the Trasciatti assassination. Maybe we can have more info on what happened.
Like who killed him? Or what happened between Flynn and Trasciatti? Trasciatti was a dog. He was a dog, man. He slept with her sister and they had a baby together. And then he sent her sister to Rome, to Italy to have the baby, and then Mussolini. So she had to come back. It was just awful. Can you imagine? You're like living with your sister and your boyfriend and you find out it was horrible. And then Trasciatti gets thrown in prison. Mussolini had been trying to nail him because he was always publishing these screeds against fascism and leading all these actions to protest Mussolini. And they got him on an advertisement for birth control. And Margaret Sanger worked to get his release. And Flynn, I just found a thank you letter that somebody wrote to her for advocating on Trasciatti's behalf. And Flynn helped to raise the money to get him out of prison. But then he got out and she realized, what he had done. And they did not have much contact after that. He tried to lure her back when she was out living on the West Coast, sort of licking her wounds with a job with the Anti-Fascist Alliance of North America. And she wouldn't take it. And then later on, she published a few things where she really questioned his integrity, because he had collaborated with federal authorities, so there was a real rift there that was personal but also political. But as for who killed Trasciatti, if that's what the question's asking, Nunzio Pernicone has written what I think is the definitive biography of Trasciatti, and he addresses that question. Steve Cerulli, the anniversary, I guess, was it last year? He held an event outside on the street corner where Trasciatti was killed. But that's who killed him again. That's not really something that I can answer.
All right. Another question is, are you familiar with Murray Kempton's profile of Gurley Flynn from Monuments of Our Time?
Yeah, I am. I don't remember. But at this point, I've read so many things. She was featured in the American Mercury, all over the place. So is there something specific about that someone wants to call attention to?
If the person who asked wants to speak up, feel free.
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that was me,
Niagara.
Mary Anne. I just would, if you hadn't read it, I would have sent it to you to assist with your, oh, what happened?
You're there. You're fine.
I can hear you.
We can hear
All
you.
right, anyway, if you hadn't seen it, I would have sent it to you, but your
Yes,
scholarship
yep, thanks. But I'll, yeah,
is up to
yeah,
it.
yeah.
There is a mural that was done by the Napa Women mural that includes Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. I'm trying to find out exactly where it is. I think it was done in 2005. I circulated among us. I don't know if I can send it to you guys, and maybe. Yeah, I can put the link in.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, Claudia Jones is undergoing a renaissance, and I think rightly so. My first Claudia Jones School event was Carol Boyce Davies' talk about her book, Left of Marx. And it was terrific. The book's terrific. Claudia Jones is terrific. I taught her this last semester in women's studies, or 2 semesters ago. And I hope that Flynn undergoes a similar renaissance, because she really is a spectacular figure, and underappreciated. Anybody else?
Yeah, there's 2 more questions I have that people wrote in the chat. Well, one is about Trasciatti. I don't know if we want to go back into that, but let's do this one. Hello, Mary Anne. I'm reading Kristen Godsey's work, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. A good read. The author presents a balanced and nuanced view, in my opinion, on how women's lives improved under state socialism. How can the left balance out conversations about the failures of state socialist regimes and their successes, especially for women, certain minority groups, and colonial revolts around the world?
Yeah, so wow, that's a great and very big question. So one of the things so Flynn's thinking about, so the first question was about when she was a wobbly, how did she feel about the wobblies and women and mothers and things, but and I think Flynn's original analysis of women's, the status of women, working class women, and their relationship to suffrage and to patriarchy generally, her belief was, if women are starving, if they're being paid starvation wages, you don't go to them if they're planning a strike and say, no, don't strike, vote. And in the next election, you can vote for politicians who will then implement, or, good labor laws, right? You want people to join, women to join unions. You want them to join the one big union so that they could fight at the place where the struggle really happens, which is in the workplace. She didn't give a lot of consideration to, to cultural issues, to other things that voting enables in terms of power and representation, nor did she have a really sophisticated analysis of the intersection of race and gender and class. But she develops that as she matures politically. And I think a lot of that, not a lot, but a good part of that comes from her experiences working with Black radicals, Claudia Jones in particular. I mean, 1948, Flynn published an essay for May Day in which she essentially talks about the triple bind that Black women, working class women, find themselves in. I mean, even before Claudia Jones's essay, even before the Combahee River Collective, before Kimberly Crenshaw coins the term intersectionality, Flynn is writing about it. So she's develops this very, very sophisticated analysis of, how work in the home affects women, and whether that work in the home should be considered labor or not, unwaged, the significance of unwaged work. And I think that we can make sort of following that trajectory, if we go to where Flynn ended up, right, which was this intersectional analysis that takes into consideration the different ways that working class women experience capitalism because of race. I think we could use that to make a really good argument that, and I haven't read the book, Sex for Women is Better Under Socialism, but I've heard the title. I think it's a really cool title. That, of course it's going to be better if you don't have to worry about cooking all the time, or feeding the baby all the time, or dealing with childcare. So if you've got a state that recognizes that women's unwaged work is actually work, and offers a way to to remove that burden. I mean, I'm thinking here about Sylvia Federici's work too on wages for housework and how we really have to include women's unwaged domestic labor in our factoring of, the system and women's contributions to the capitalist system. So if we think that way, if we think about Flynn's later analysis, I think we could make some really strong arguments that everything's better for women when the state recognizes the work that women do, the domestic labor that women do, when we have a state that recognizes that women struggle in capitalism, not just with patriarchy, but with white supremacy, and that actively works to address the way that white supremacy affects working class women, Black women, the way xenophobia affects immigrant or even immigrant women of all races, but particularly brown and Black immigrant women. I think we can't help but have a better world for women. But I think it's Flynn's later feminism, again, I think matured by her interactions with people like Claudia Jones and others in the party, traveling to Paris for the Conference on Women after the war, that really opens her up to this possibility. And I think, that kind of thinking is what we need. I mean, when people throw like failed socialist states out as evidence that socialism doesn't work, I mean, all we have to do is look at our own state right now. I mean, if we want to point to the Soviet Union as a state that proves that a communist or a socialist economy doesn't quite work, and we could point to a contemporary US as proof that a capitalist economy doesn't work. And women arguably had advantages in the Soviet state that they do not have here, like access to childcare and to jobs and other things. So that's a long-winded answer, but I think, I think we have to be careful of those easy dismissals of socialism because, Stalin or whoever, right? Because we can just say Reagan or Trump, or I don't want to blame everything on Trump because I think that then blinds us to how it really is a systemic failure.
All right, we got a few more questions. I don't know, Maria, do you want to take over like some of these questions? I know you've seen some of them too. Okay. All right, I'm up to mine two of these that just came in. So how do you think Gurley Flynn would have responded to last week's events, and what does this Red Scare look like today?
I think she would have called out the insurrectionists as fascists and would have advocated that she would have also, I think, recognized immediately the complicity of certain segments of law enforcement, which made it easy for them to gain access, or certainly easier than it should have been. And I think she would have issued the same caution, however, that I did, which is we can't endorse increased surveillance and blanket sedition laws because that's not going to work out well for us in the end. And she'd be an absolute advocate of Antifa. I mean, she was, again, one of the first members of Antifa in the US. What does the Red Scare look like today? The Red Scare looks, well, it looks a little different because we're getting post-Cold War more and more. So, the Democratic candidates who just won in Georgia, both of them were painted with the socialist brush, right? And it didn't work. And even if people believed that they were in fact socialists, they didn't believe enough to care not to vote for them. Certainly we saw Bernie Sanders, right, still grappling with that legacy. But I think every year that we move away from the Cold War, it gets easier and easier for leftists to run for office and to shrug off the socialist epithet because, I've got DSA colleagues here, young people for whom, socialist is a label they're proud of. And I think, the targets now have been Black Lives Matter protesters and Antifa. So again, it looks a little bit different. It works in some ways the same, but certainly the label socialist, I mean, that's like yesterday's news increasingly.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of, speaking on behalf of not behalf of, but on the Claudia Jones School and like the education we do, there's a lot of former like CP members that, spoke of the twin weapons of capitalism, which is, racism and anti-communism. So that's their biggest weapons. So we have to fight against that as, the lefts or progressives.
Yeah. Flynn actually believed that fascism, this isn't a verbatim quote, I don't think, but it's really close. There's one article she has in the Daily Worker where she calls it, I think it's the putrid spawn of capitalism. So that, inevitably when capitalist states fail, fascism is the result. And so she would completely agree that with the analysis that you just articulated. And of course, white supremacy is a tool of fascism and xenophobia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess before we leave the previous question, do you have any comments on, I guess, the Cold War, Red Scare with China right now?
No, I mean, we're still sort of, it's anybody's, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? I'm still sort of watching that story develop, right? At this point, my thoughts are kind of too inchoate to really say anything. So I guess the answer is no, I'm still kind of thinking about it. It's still playing out in real time, right? But I'm not surprised. And one of the things that I didn't mention in the talk was one of the things I like to emphasize about Flynn all the time is that she's a homegrown radical. She's born in New Hampshire, raised in the Bronx. She's Irish American. And that's an important point because for most of the history of the US, we have labeled those who critique capitalism as un-American. The critique itself is an import and it's un-American, and capitalism is the quintessential American economic system. And so we've tended to racialize anti-capitalist critique. And so I think part of the fuel for the fire of the Cold War was this kind of racialized vision of the Soviet Union, these Asiatics. There's actually, who's that priest? There was an not Father Coughlin, but there was another anti-communist priest who said, Russia, Marx gave it a kind of a Jewish intellectual bent, but it was Russia that gave communism an Asiatic soul, right? And I think we see some of that playing out with the Chinese now also, this kind of implication of race and ideology here. So, they're Chinese, they're these inscrutable Asians, they've got this really horrible system, and it all kind of feeds into the same logic. I mean, we haven't moved very far, quite frankly, in in decades. We're fighting the same battles. I mean, good gosh, we're still trying to, fend off the Russians. What was it? The first thing people said after the insurrection and on the Capitol was, "Oh my gosh, the Russians are licking their chops now." Oh my God.
Yeah, well, I'm sure people have been following, like all the ultra right that was in the protest was saying that Antifa infiltrated and did the insurrection.
Right?
It's complete BS, but
yeah,
y'all know the story. So, anyways, there's another good question here. Does any person today remind you of Miss Flynn or Miss Gurley Flynn?
Does anybody today remind me? Oh my gosh, that's a really good question.
Thank you.
I don't.
Chris Bell, yeah, that was Chris.
I don't know. I'd be curious to know what other people. See, this is a clever rhetorical ploy. I'm going to be expansive and let other people say what they think. I've never thought of that before. I mean, who's? I don't know. Any suggestions? Anybody? Joelle Fishman? Anybody else? I don't know. It's really hard to say.
Casey in Georgia, maybe.
Yeah, but Flynn she ran for office a few times, but she was not, she really wasn't concerned with electoral politics in quite the same way. But perhaps, Angela Davis, that's it. Yeah, I'd have to be, Angela Davis is probably the closest we have right now.
You ever heard of, I think, Joanne Cesamard? She is in Cuba. She fled the U.S. for her activities. You can look her up.
Yeah, you're talking about Asada Shakur.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh.
that was a phenomenal book. That actually is my absolute favorite book, so far, at least.
Yeah, I mean,
But-
I gave her original name because people might know her from her original name, but I didn't mean to disrespect her by not calling her the name you just, Miss Shakur.
That's a really good suggestion. Yeah.
Maybe there isn't just one of us. Maybe there's a whole generation of people that try to walk in her footsteps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dolores Huerta.
Oh, Dolores. Yeah. So, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There's some great activists out there. Flynn is one of our foremothers, but certainly there's still many around, admirable women.
Do we have time for one or two more questions? I don't know. How are people feeling?
Somebody asked about Flynn and Margaret Sanger.
Yeah.
Margaret Sanger's become a controversial figure. That's another one that I kind of walk a fine line on. I mean, she had some awful things to say with regard to eugenics completely. And I don't write about Sanger. I don't research about Sanger. But she also did extraordinary work to bring, knowledge about reproduction and access to birth control to women. And that, I mean, she just did, and she took risks to do it. She and Flynn were friends. Margaret Sanger, actually, when she first started her activist career, was phobic about speaking. And there's a really sweet exchange between Flynn and Sanger, where she confesses that she's worried about giving a speech, and Flynn writes back, "Oh, you'll be fine, Margaret dear. The cause is a just one, and you're really smart." And so it's a very sweet exchange. So they were mutually supportive. As I mentioned, Sanger was very supportive of Carlo Tresco when he was imprisoned for the birth control advertisement. She also helped to publicize that the imprisonment of Tresco was really at the behest of Mussolini. So the US was dancing on a string, so to speak, for the Italian fascist government. So they were friends and mutually supportive.
All right, I have another one here. Let's see. Well, there's probably one that's this person was asking before to ask it again. Was Gurley Flynn still Tresca's partner at the time she became a dedicated member of the CPUSA?
No.
Okay.
No.
Hello.
Nope.
And then there's another question about the IWW. How did she fall into the Haywood and De Leon's IWW split, if you know?
I don't think she did. What year was that? I don't think it figured very prominently in her thinking. I mean, Flynn's been called like, oh, not particularly intellectual, and like she didn't really involve herself in theoretical disputes, and I wouldn't say that. I don't think, I mean, I'm not very theoretical. She wasn't very theoretical, but she was extraordinarily smart. She was an orator and an organizer. And, for her, what mattered was being on the ground, appealing to working people. That was really what she lived for. So I don't, a theoretical dispute would not have been a very interesting, she wasn't going to die on that hill. It was about collecting money and getting people, out of jail and striking. And I mean, she had questions about strike tactics, like those of you who know about the Patterson strike and the pageant they had where they brought it to New Jersey in 1913. I'm talking about, right? She was adamantly opposed to that. She said, what are you thinking, people? There's a strike and you want to bring a version of that to the stage? And no, you got to stay there and pick it, because while you're in New York performing, they're going to be pulling, scabs and putting them into the factories. So her thinking was very practical that way. Yeah, it was an earlier split. And I think, she ended up on the side of Haywood, but I don't think that, ideological disagreements were really her forte.
Yeah, I remember hearing some story about her. I forgot from some comrade somewhere, but they were saying like Gurley Flynn like never read Marx or Lenin or anything, but she was like a major like organizer. So like I guess I'm not sure if she put herself down for like not knowing the theory that Marx and Engels wrote and Lenin, but she was like a major organizer, so she could, you know, organize a rally or labor strike, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was inspirational in general. So
Oh, absolutely.
everyone online is like, oh, I've read all this Marx and Lenin, blah blah blah, young people. So it's like, yeah, like you're terminally online, so you're not really doing anything in person. So
I can't get on the chat. Could I ask a question?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Mary, I got a quick question. It seems to me like at one time the IWW in the earlier days and the CP had a good relationship. It seems to me that in this day and age, historically, they could almost work together again because they're both, as far as IWW being a labor organizer and the CP being a political party, it seems to me that they would have so much an ability to work together much easier now, instead of like say the AFL-CIO, which is basically so much more of a capitalist bourgeois labor organizers, and the IWW is definitely anti-capitalist. So it just seems to me like this day and age, they would be able to work together in a much more easier, as they at one time did.
Yeah, I mean, you may be right. You know, that's an interesting question to ponder. I mean, what's the most radical labor organization out there right now? I mean, is it the IWW? They're not particularly powerful. I don't know.
Right? Yeah, they're not particularly powerful, but they're organizing areas of workers that the other unions have no idea what to do, like gig workers.
Mm-hmm.
They're organizing workers that nobody else even bothers with.
Yep.
And they'll take the time to get in there and try to organize them.
Yep.
So it's kind of like what the CP did many years ago with the African American community. And I'm just thinking it's they would have a natural ability to work together in organizing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, anti-capitalist labor unions, they would have that in common, right?
Yep.
As opposed to, yeah, I think, you know, initially even the AFL was opposed to the wage labor system, and eventually they abandoned their opposition to wage labor as a system and said a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, right? And the IWW insisted that the real liberation for working people would come.
And they won't sign contracts either.
Yeah.
Because that takes away their ability to strike.
Yeah.
So they won't sign contracts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, no particular labor union is all that powerful right now anyway. Although I will say one of the things I'm learning from doing this research is even the CIO and the CP, they were never as strong as people feared they might be, right? Either in terms of numbers or in terms of their potential to foment revolution. You know, the demons inside people's heads about them were always way more powerful than their actual numbers on the ground. Hence the you know, the swiftness with which they were repressed. Somebody asked a question about Helen Keller too. A lot of people don't know that Helen Keller she was a leftist, and somebody sent me, I published a piece in Jacobin. I don't know if there are anti-Jacobin people in the audience, forgive me, because I know that Jacobin's the publication now that a lot of people like to not like, but I published a piece in Jacobin in May about the Flynn's ouster from the ACLU, and got a lovely letter from somebody who told me something that I didn't know. Helen Keller actually wrote to Flynn while she was at Alderson, a lovely note. And it was published in the Daily Worker in her block, you know, in her print. So she was she and Flynn were friendly, and remained so, as did Flynn and Dorothy Day. There were a lot of people who wouldn't stand by communists during the Smith Act trials, but these women and some others did.
Dorothy definitely did.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she used to pay. I interviewed a guy who worked on the transcript for the trial. He was this lovely guy. He'd never been interviewed before about his involvement in the party. And Dorothy Day, he said, used to pass him notes to pass on to Elizabeth, to keep her spirits up during the trial. So.
Hi, this is Mary.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Mary Eleazar. I wanted to insert some historical notes that I have familiarity with, because my mother's father wrote for the IWW publication out of Duluth, Minnesota, and I just found out recently it's really Superior, Wisconsin, which is across the bridge from Duluth. And I understand in Finnish, because all my grandparents were immigrants from Finland in 1900. And then he wrote humorous plays, I understand, for one thing, but we don't have any copies or anything. And then my father was a iron ore miner. Makes me cry. He died in a mining accident, which was called an accident, but we have our doubts, because he was a great supporter of the Union. And so they moved him to a more dangerous area of the mine, and then he was dead, I understand, within a few days. And it was pretty bad. And I was 13 at the time. And we had a CP member, cousin in the family, older, my mother's cousin, etc. And what else was I going to say? Oh, anyway, so I worked with the Black Panther Party a lot myself in DC, Baltimore, Oakland, and Berkeley. And my daughter got to go to their school for 7 years in Oakland under Erica Huggins' direction. Wonderful direction.
Thank you for sharing that. Just a call to the audience. If there are things that, I love hearing these personal stuff. By the way, my grandparents were coal miners, and I lost an uncle in a mining accident. It really was an accident, but he was only 16. It was terrible. So I empathize. But yeah, and if you know anything that I don't know, please, any readings or things you want to, or primary sources, please email me. I can put my email in the chat, and then I'd love to hear these things.
Hi, my name is Yabo Onikwede. Dante, would you pin me, please? So my birth name is Elizabeth Yabo Onikwede. I am named after Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She's my great aunt.
Oh,
And I just have so much tears. I didn't know her. I was born in 1965, but my mother was her sister Annie's daughter. And my mother, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, my father was one of the first Nigerians to come to the US to study. And he studied at Columbia University, studying political philosophy. And so he would go to all these underground political meetings, and he met Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sis. My grandma's name was Kathy, not Annie." So anyway, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn brought my dad home to meet my mom, her niece. She brought home a very dark-skinned Black man to meet her niece. And my mother married my father and moved to Nigeria. She lived there for umpteen years, raised 3 kids that are now all here in the States. And so I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't get to meet her. In our culture, when a grandma dies, the next female in the family is named Iyabo, which means grandmother has returned. And so they would say I'm 3 in 1, both my grandmothers and Grandma Elizabeth. So I just wanted to say thank you. We are so impressed. My sister, I'm more outgoing, my sister's online here with us. And she met Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in 1963 in New York when my mother brought her. And we also have one more living relative who's in her 90s, who's in California. Her name is Roberta. She's a niece to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. But along with my other ancestors, she hangs in my home. And I actually, as a second career, I have gotten into doing racial healing work and anti-racism work. And I keep reading her work and studying her work, trying to find a piece that we're missing as a country. And so I am actually, every day I read from this book, which is the first version of my life as a political prisoner. And I keep, I just rotate her books and I read, and I'm trying to, I don't think I would say I fall under the communist umbrella. Certainly I want democratic socialism, because we need to take care of the most vulnerable in our population. And so that's what my work centers on. I'm co-director of an organization called Compassionate Atlanta, and that's what we do. Our goal is to make the ethic of compassion the center virtue in the city. So we just amplify the voice of compassion, and that's what we do all day long, is look at the most vulnerable among us. And so I just wanted to introduce myself and say thank you and let you know that there's blood out here.
That's great. So so your sister Kathy's granddaughter.
Yes.
Cool. And Kathy's the one who sustained Elizabeth when Elizabeth was at Alderson. She wrote to her, she visited her,
Yes.
she babysat when Buster was little, when your cousin, I guess, right?
Yes.
Your cousin once
My uncle,
removed.
my uncle.
Oh, your uncle, right. Oops.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she was like a mainstay of the family. Yeah, that's terrific. Oh yeah. And I've read some biographies or was read one by Steve Nelson with Jim Barrett and I forget who else, and then California Red, the book about Dorothy Healy, and they comment, everyone who knew her in the party, and even the person, Bob Lewis, whom I interviewed, who was head of the Young Communist League at Cornell when Flynn spoke there, they all remember how kind she was and compassionate. Steve Nelson says when he left the party, people didn't talk to him except she did. Dorothy Healy talks about how kind she was and just really generous. And so there's that family, you've got that coursing through your the spirit of the ancestors.
The
right?
older I get, the more it calls.
Now, did you contact the guy, what's his name, the guy who just wrote the novel? Because when I wrote to him, he wrote back and said, oh, one of her great nieces and we had this great conversation. He emailed me that.
He was lovely. I loved his book. The book was great, learning about, out in the West Coast, Spokane, Washington and stuff. It was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I recommend everybody buy that book and hold on to it. I really talk a lot about it on social media.
That's great. I have my copy. I haven't read it yet. When I was researching her free speech, her activism in the free speech fights, I went to Missoula and Spokane. And it's really interesting to be in those spaces, imagining. The story that she chained herself to a lamppost is, alas, not true. But it was still so audacious. You think this 19-year-old girl getting on a train and just going west and advocating for these miners and in these towns with all these itinerant workers. It's really amazing to go and be in those places. So I look forward to reading the book.
Yeah, I did it on Audible, and then I would refer to the book. I so miss my parents. They're both gone, but my mother was more quiet. So when you'd get her alone, she would talk about Aunt Elizabeth like she was there. So we grew up with these stories. I have held, so my parents were atheists and she was an atheist. Somehow, I don't know what happened. That's how DNA gets messed up. I came out the womb screaming Jesus, loving on anything Jesus. And I've held in Alderson, she had a Bible, and every single page, she had pencil notations in it. And I've held it, I've read her books, I grew up with her books in my home. And all I ever heard was about her. So it's my loss that I wasn't born early enough like my sister.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'm so glad you came, and I'm so glad that you let yourself be known. Wow. That's really terrific. What a great family legacy.
Mary, this is Michelle. This is Michelle Art. And I dropped a couple of notes in chat. I'm the daughter of 2 Smith Act victims. And I knew Elizabeth Gurley Flynn well. I was a young person, a teenager, and she died before I could know her when I became an adult. But she was very, very good friends with my parents, especially my mother, Helen Winter. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was an extremely warm, caring person. And she gave me a set of records of the Red Army Chorus, which I treasure. And she cared about children. She cared about young people coming up in struggle. And the question that was asked about her ideological thinking, I'll bet that she had read those books, many of them, but she didn't quote them because it was more important to her that she acted on them. And I think that that is true of many, many people of that era. And I cringe when I see some of the 20, 30-year-olds who can quote every page of Capital, but haven't been active in a darn thing. And if we have influence over, it's much more important to build community, to be a part of community, to struggle with other people in the working class, not just to go it alone and know everything about it. But anyhow, I just wanted to say that she is a real treasure. And Diabo, how wonderful to hear from you. My oldest daughter is named Elizabeth after Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Her middle name is Allison, which is my mother's maiden name. And she took that during World War I, when Wagner-Knecht, one of the founders of the Communist Party of the United States, my grandfather, everyone else took the name Allison because during World War I, having a German name was not good, particularly if you were communist.
Thank you, Michelle. It's lovely to meet you.
And she did, you're right, Michelle, she did engage with these works. She was an orator. Later on, she wrote a column for the Daily Worker. She was on the radio. She did all of that kind of, all of that work, but she was first and foremost an orator. I mean, I have letters that people wrote to her in their 80s. So one guy in California saying, I remember the first time I heard you speaking about Sacco and Vanzetti in the 20s, and you lifted your hand up, and I thought, oh my God, that's the most beautiful hand I've ever seen. And it was so vividly impressed on his memory. It was really incredible. But so what she did, she kept, you can find these at Tamamits at NYU, you can see it, she kept a journal. And so she would read something like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, for example, and she would make notes about how she could use it in a speech to make it relevant to working class people. And I will tell you that, I've had friends on here, I don't know if they're still on here anymore, who went to graduate school with me and who said, oh my gosh, I remember you were doing this research in graduate school. I'm kind of embarrassed about that because it was a little while ago. But I'd been reading, and the first time, or the only time probably, that I actually thought, the first time that I thought, I know what it feels like to be someone kind of like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. I mean, I don't have any pretensions to being that, dynamic of an organizer or an orator, but was when I taught a class of shop stewards with the IBEW, and I taught them a public speaking class. And there was a moment where it just all felt like it was working, it was clicking, and they were giving these impassioned speeches about the need to organize, and it was this really great moment. And I thought, oh, this is this is the kind of work that she did. It was not theoretical. It was not academic. It was, you know, she didn't sit around discussing theory. She was out talking to working people and getting them, you know, helping them to see what they could do as workers, right, to organize themselves in the struggle. Oh, one of my friends from graduate school just popped into the chat. It was like, what, 5 years ago, Mary Liz, at least. So anyway, yes, that's completely true. She did, you know, whatever she did read, the theory was always useful for organizing, because that's what mattered, very practical. Not that there's anything wrong with theory.
All right, Maria, do you want to close it out, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up a little bit. I didn't know from Jerry and Dante want to give just the short précis of the genesis of the two organizations, just quick. But I do want to mention that we have two events coming up. Thursday, March 18th, Fiorello LaGuardia and the Left, the Unknown Stories, sponsored by the VMF and the New Haven Public Library. And Tuesday, April 20th, we'll be celebrating National Poetry Month with the presentation of Genevieve Taggart, Portrait of a Radical Left Modernist Poet by Julia Lacella, who's here tonight. But I wanted to thank everyone before we signed off, and before you guys can just give your last thing about how to get in touch with us all. I want to thank Mary Anne, obviously, who directed us to the Claudia Jones School, and to Dante O'Hara for his help, technical and otherwise, and Adam Meyer for making this event possible, and all of you for attending and sticking with us and chatting and sharing your stories. So the next one is March 18th. The next one's after that's April 20th. And we don't send out a lot of emails. It's just when we're actually doing something. So if you've given us your emails, we would like to use that to stay in touch with you. But let me introduce Dr. Meyer, Professor Meyer. He's one of the people who saved Ostro's College. People will tell you that. He'll give us a little genesis about Vito Marcantonio Forum, and Dante will do the same for Claudia Jones, because he's been seeing it from the ground up. So I'll just say good evening, and you guys take it away.
It's been such a rich discussion, but that's exhausting in its own nice way, you know. But I don't know. I think that we've said pretty much everything. I think that what we need is a couple of hundred, like the next year, you know, Vito Marcantonio forums and you know, Claudia Jones groups. I think that if we could populate all the neighborhoods, all the cities in this country, and I think it was lovely what that woman said before, to build community is critical. You know, there's so many bullshit artists on the left. It's just awful. It's just so embarrassing, you know. And I think that we have to prefigure in some way that we're socialist, that we reach out to people, we help people, we're available, we share our resources, including time. If we can't do that, what would we do if we had power? You know, you should run for your life, you know. So I think it's possible, but it has to be done on a certain, I think, level actually of quantitatively, or in terms of size and so on. So people get to really know one another, and I think that's what religion provides for people. I don't think religion provides so much that people are going to be living in the sky with the angels and all that. That's really not what's going on. It's that it provides community, and community to immigrants and people that are oppressed. I think that I was always so contemptuous of my mother, was so religious, you know, and really what I realized later, she had such a terrible life. Oh my God, my mother had an awful life. It was consoling to her. That was what was available to her, and that it prevented demoralization. I think that's what religion does. It prevents demoralization. You're not going to go all the way down. That there's a kind of a level that you're not going to go past. We can do that. We must do that. And if we don't, I don't know, it's not about empathy so much, it's about solidarity. It's not I feel so bad. Oh, blah, 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 blah. No, it's to solidarize with other people. And look, today was a wonderful example. The sharing here is so wonderful. My heart is full. It's just so great. And look across generational, the barriers that exist in the society, they all collapsed here today. I mean, and in a very democratic experience, So I want to thank Mary Anne and oh my God, and Maria's been working and Adam and oh my God, so and there should be more. I do really think I can fairly and to really like to invite you to listen to the next Zoom that we have, which I think is the 18th. Am I right on it? I rarely know what day it is, so when it gets to dates, it's like,
Actually,
The
what?
March 18th.
I'll put the 2 dates in the chat just to
Yeah.
remind people.
Thank you. And that's going to be on LaGuardia. And I think that what we see, if we take Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and we take Claudia and Marcantonio, I mean, this system has a way of erasing them and forgetting all of their contributions and shoving them into a corner. But there are some famous people like Fiorello LaGuardia, and what they do then who really were very left, and what they do with those people is they launder them. You can't hide LaGuardia. There's no way to do it. So what occurs in those situations is that there's a narrative or an interpretation of them which removes them from the left. And LaGuardia was very much on the left in a somewhat idiosyncratic way, but he was an extraordinarily left figure. And that's what I'll be talking about on the 18th. I'd love to see you there. And if you'd like to know more about Vito Marcantonio, I wrote a biography, Vito Marcantonio, Radical Politician, which I think I spent. I don't want you to know how long a time I spent on it, but I think it's in his 4th book, and we get to know Marcantonio. Marcantonio was not a communist, a member, but he was pro-communist. And there were so many pro-communist people. I think that we know a lot of the parents of a lot of our friends and so on. And but what he had in common with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Claudia Jones is that it is something very strong. I think if I could find that the 3 principles that Marcantonio had that illuminated his politics were related immediately to communism. I think there were 3 of them. I think the first was that that the communists, the first victims of fascism are communists. He said that over and over and over again, that behind the banner of fascism marches anti-communism. And then I think what else he said, what else I think was very deep in his thinking is that you could not build a broad front without the Communist Party, that the Communist Party added something that no one else could add. It didn't mean you had to be a communist, he wasn't. But without the Communist Party, there would not be the direction, there wouldn't be the coordination, there wouldn't be the ideology and the history that would enable workers and other people to unite and struggle successfully. People are always struggling. Under the worst situations, people struggle. That's part of human nature. But to struggle to win, we have to, and I think what we have to do, we have to win for people. That's what works. We have to create situations where we have palpable victories. And that gives people good reason to change their routines in life and to go past things which they hadn't expected to do. Well, it was a wonderful evening. Just wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, Dante, can you give us a little bit more about the Claudia Jones School of Political Education? Because you just opened last year, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I did want to first thank the Vito Marcantonio Forum for inviting us to be co-sponsors. Mary Anne, this is a beautiful presentation about Liz Gurley Flynn, and yeah, I hope we can host you again in the future, and I'm hoping we can have another event with the Vito Marcantonio Forum in the future as well, and keep building this relationship, even though we're in 2 different cities. But hopefully I can come visit you guys once the pandemic is over, and vice versa as well. So so yeah, I don't have to say a whole lot about Claudia. I was going to say some stuff about Claudia, but I think Mary Anne, you've already done a whole lot of work for me. So Claudia and Liz Gurley Flynn were friends, and became actually closer within the Alderson prison. Claudia was released early because her health issues, and then she was deported under the McCarran Act to London, right? And then she would later go on to organize the Notting Hill Carnival, which still exists today, and also the West Indian Gazette newspaper. And she was organizing around Afro-Caribbeans and other folks in London. And and then she passed away in 1964 due to a heart condition, unfortunately, which carried on from her childhood from poor housing conditions in Harlem. So, but yeah, the school was mostly an idea around this time 2 years ago. I personally moved to DC. Now it's been a year and a few months, and then some friends of mine were thinking of this idea, some elders here in DC, to bring about a popular education school similar to the Jefferson School that existed in Harlem back in the 1930s and 40s, where W.B. Du Bois taught at for some time as well. And for folks that don't know, there's I don't know if there's a specific book about the Jefferson School, but there's a lot of books that relate to it, like Du Bois's biographies and etc. And if you've studied the Communist Party as well, there's some references to that as well, based in Harlem. So what we're trying to do is build a popular education space, forums. We're developing relationships with the left embassies. We have a relationship with the Nicaraguan embassy, Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to build popular education for the masses of working people, not just in DC, but this whole country. But we want to start locally in our community and build from there, and organize these folks, because we're within the imperial core, like they like to say in DC. So yeah, so we had our first event last February during Black History Month. We hosted Bill Fletcher Jr., which many of you may know already. And then things shut down immediately after. And then we just went straight to webinars. So our first event was co-hosted with a Black Youth Project organization, talking about Angela Davis's incarceration and comparing it to the struggle against jails in DC and building new institutions of prison in DC. And then we hosted Carol Boyce Davies in July to talk about Claudia's life and her book on Claudia's life right here, Left of Karl Marx. So I suggest everyone read this book. It's amazing. And also she has another one that followed up about Claudia's essays and poems. There's also a poem in here that was written to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in here as well. And I'm not going to read it because I don't want to waste too much more time, but I highly recommend folks get these books. There may be some PDFs lying around somewhere that someone has a free copy, but support authors, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, so,
Dante, who published them, Dante?
That's a good question. Who published this first one? Duke University for the Left of Karl Marx, and I want to say this is a British publisher for the other one. IE, but I don't know what that is, but.
Okay.
Yeah, the other one, I'm not sure. I think it's a British publisher though. It's like AIBA or something. Abia Clark Publishing Limited. So. Do you want to close with reading the poem about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn? I mean, I can. I'm not a poet. It's okay. Poems are written for everyone. Right, so. Right. Let me see if I can find it. I saw it earlier. Nice way to end. Let me see. My voice has been like cracking tonight too, but let's see. Well, that's a pretty big book. Here we go. Okay, so this was, I think, written in 1955, and I apologize if I am too far from my laptop to hear me clearly, but all right. I think I'll always see you everywhere. At morn, when sunlight's radiance bathes all things like verse, proclaiming man, not beast, is king of all the universe. I'll see you in the young, shooting sprouts that sneer at weeds, age gnarled and doubt, abusers who defile an epithet, a life well lived in service built from strife. I'll see you at noontime, when the sun in orbit flings its rays like thyme through the skies on days that hurt, causing you to weld a new full courage spurt. I'll see you oft at twilight's dusk before the sun will fade. I'll conjure up your twinkling laugh, your eyes so much like jade. I'll see you in the dark of night when nature seeks her rest, except the reedy crickets who moose and watch, I guess. I'll think of you forever and how your spirit rings, because your faith leaps as a flame, sweet nurture to all things. Of all the times I'll miss you most is when I'm least aware, because you will intrude, I know, upon my inner ear. Beloved comrade, when from you I tear, my mind, my heart, my thoughts you'll hear. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to thank you all again for coming. I think we can all get in touch with each other again because I think we seem to have all your information. And I just want to wish you all to have a happy new year because I think this year will be a little bit better. And be nicer to us anyway. Be safe and let's stay in touch. Thank you so much, Mary Anne. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Adam,
Thank you.
Dante. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.
Great event.
Good
Thanks.
night,
so much.
everybody.
Yeah.
Thank
you guys
you.
did
Good
it.
night.
Thank you. Good night.
Great evening.
Yes.
Take care.